Find a new way to live in Toronto's coveted Forest Hill neighborhood. Foray by Canderel blends thoughtful, livable suite design with refined finishes and more than 50,000 square feet of amenities, including wellness spaces, work-from-home areas, fitness facilities, and places to unwind. A modern, elevated community crafted for the life you've earned. Your next home starts from $599,000. Learn more at live@foray.ca. That's live at FORET.ca.
We all have to acknowledge that it's not just these heroes who jumped out of airplanes and had to try to save the Jewish people, but their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. And there's something tragic about that.
That's the voice of Israeli-Canadian author and journalist Matti Friedman, drawing a line between the real-life characters in his new book, Out of the Sky, and the young Israelis of today. At the center of the story is the 23-year-old Zionist icon Hannah Senesh, who parachuted into Nazi-occupied Europe in 1944. But Friedman says her story didn't end there, because since October 7th, a new generation of young Israelis has also rushed into danger, becoming, in some cases, household names and symbols of Jewish resistance and bravery, perhaps none more so than Hersh Goldberg-Polin, the American Israeli who was taken hostage at the Nova Music Festival after using his body to shield others from grenades, and later murdered by Hamas in a tunnel under Gaza. Friedman's book is a personal journey to understand who Hannah Senesh really was, and how she became the heroine the young Jewish state needed in the years leading up to 1948. He retraces her path from her early life as a poet in Budapest to her decision to leave her widowed mother and brother behind while restrictions on Hungary's Jews tightened and the war loomed. She made her way to British Mandate Palestine, where she became a farm worker until 1943, when she volunteered for a secret mission. She was one of 32 Jewish parachutists trained by the British and sent back into Nazi-occupied Europe to help Allied airmen escape and to bring hope to Jewish communities facing annihilation. Whether they succeeded, and Friedman argues they did not, at least not militarily, wasn't really the point. The mission, he says, was also about something else, creating a story of heroism to inspire a people facing catastrophe and to shape the identity of a future state.
The Jews in the 1940s are presented with this absolutely horrific picture of millions of people being marched to their deaths. And they need a different story. The Zionist movement cannot live with that story because it flies against the ethos of Zionism, which is action.
I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Monday, April 20th, 2026. Welcome to North Star, the flagship podcast of the Canadian Jewish News, made possible by the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. Toronto native Matti Friedman's new book arrives at a moment of remembrance. Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, has just passed. Yom HaZikaron, honoring Israel's fallen soldiers and victims of terror, begins tonight. And Israel's Independence Day follows immediately after. Friedman began working on this book before October 7th, but he lived through the war that followed, one that brought the story he was writing into the present. He lives in the same Jerusalem neighborhood as the family of Hersh Goldberg-Polin. They attended the same synagogue. Friedman dedicated the book to Hersh and to Yuval Shoham, much less well known, a childhood friend of Hersh, an IDF tank corps member who searched for him in Gaza, calling out his name before he too lost his life. Matti Friedman joined me from New York, where he launched his book after a 40-hour journey from Israel. So in the end of the book, you dedicated it to Hersh Goldberg-Polin and Yuval Shoham. Many of our listeners and viewers will, of course, know Hersh's name, one of the most famous, unfortunately, hostages. The other name is probably a lot less well-known outside of Israel. Can you tell us what these two young men represent for you?
They both went to the same synagogue that I go to in South Jerusalem, which is a minyan called Hakel, and I knew them both as just kind of young guys at shul. Both of them in their early 20s. Both of them just wonderful young people. Both of them the sons of very good friends of mine. So Hersh Goldberg-Polin was a recently discharged soldier. He was kind of starting his life. He was a really literary guy, really funny and good-natured. And he went to a music festival on the border with Gaza on October 7th called the Nova Festival, which of course becomes infamous afterward. And he's taken hostage from the festival amid the slaughter of 360 other people who were at the festival, and he's taken alive. He loses a hand, but he's taken alive, and he's alive until the following summer when he's murdered by his Palestinian captors along with 5 other hostages in a tunnel under Rafah. So that's Hersh. And Yuval was a soldier during this war. He, according to the stories, he was in Gaza and he would shout Hersh's name, because part of the point for him and for many of us was that this war was meant to return the hostages, and Hersh was our hostage, the one who was, very much in our minds. And Yuval was killed in his tank in combat in Gaza. So our very little community in Jerusalem lost two kids, and it was, of course, shattering. Both of them were lovers of books, and it struck me that there was a connection between them and the subject matter of this book. Both were heroic in their own way, and both were very literary, and it seemed fitting to dedicate a book about literary heroes to the two of them.
How, when you knew about this, of course, while you're writing your book, so how did their deaths and the hostage-taking situation impact your actual writing journey while you were doing this, if at all?
Right, it all happens as I'm writing the book. The events of the war certainly penetrated my writing space in Jerusalem and made their way into the pages of the book. So the mindset, I think, of these characters was much easier for me to understand after October 7th, because we all found ourselves in a very dark moment. And I'm not comparing it to 1944, but it was a dark moment for the Jewish people. So the events outside my window definitely changed my perception of the events that I was writing about. And I think we all have to acknowledge that it's not just these heroes who jumped out of airplanes and had to try to save the Jewish people, but their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. And there's something tragic about that.
Let's talk about that. One of the 2 boys that you mentioned is much more well-known, iconic symbol. And Yuval less so outside, as I said before. How do you explain that gap, or how should we look at that gap in terms of their heroic fame after their deaths?
Hersh was well known because he was a hostage, and because his parents did everything in their power to bring him home. They went to meet the Pope, and they met every world leader who would meet them, who they thought could do something, and in the end, no one could do anything. And in this journey that they had, they and he became symbols for, not just for Jews, for many people, but certainly for Jewish people, of really just noble, deep Jewish dedication. That's what John and Rachel Polin became for many people, and that made Hersh, I think, known to millions of people. I've met people who have very little connection to Israel or to the conflict, and they know Hersh. And he became one of the symbols of the war in the most tragic way. I still see pictures of him, all over Jerusalem, and I have to remind myself that this was a kid I sat next to in shul. He became a kind of global figure. Yuval was an amazing young man, extremely smart and thoughtful. He served in the Armored Corps. He was a tank crewman, and he was one of many hundreds of soldiers who were killed in this war. So for people who are looking at this from the outside, his name stands out less. He wasn't a symbol. He was, just a kid, and the loss is the same. And the interpretation is what changes the way people see these different characters. And there is, of course, a similarity to the story of the parachutists, where we have a group of 32 parachutists, but really only one name remains from the mission, and that's the name Hannah Senesh. She becomes the symbol of the mission because people need symbols, and Hannah is selected because, I mean, a lot of what my book is about why Hannah became the symbol, but she becomes the symbol because she has a great story, because she's a great writer, because she leaves one of the most famous Hebrew songs, which is, of course, Eli Eli, which many of us grew up singing in Hebrew school. It's not necessarily that her accomplishments were any greater. In fact, in military terms, she had no accomplishments. So it's a matter of how she's seen. And she served the purposes of the people telling the story more than the other characters, most of whom have been forgotten.
Well, what was the purpose? Why did Israel at the time, and today even, need this heroine?
So these people were sent, this is a mission of a small group of young Jews sent in 1944 back into occupied Europe. These are people who escaped the Holocaust and then volunteered to parachute back into the Holocaust. And they serve British special operations. They're wearing British uniforms, and they have an official British mission. And at the same time, they're serving what is not yet the state of Israel. They serve the Zionist movement and the Haganah, and they're supposed to somehow save Jews in Europe. And of course, they can't really do that either. Right? 32 people are not going to save the Jews of Europe or defeat the Wehrmacht. What they do is provide a narrative of heroism to people who badly needed a narrative of heroism. And the Jews in the 1940s are presented with this absolutely horrific picture of millions of people being marched to their deaths. And they need a different story. The Zionist movement cannot live with that story because it flies against the ethos of Zionism, which is action and military heroism. So they need heroes to inspire action on the part of particularly young Jews after the war. So they create heroes, and the Zionist movement does this in several cases. I mean, one great Zionist hero is Joseph Trumpeldor, and people grew up with the myth of Trumpeldor dying in a skirmish with Arab marauders and shouting in Hebrew, "Tov lamut ba'ad artzenu." It's good to die for our country. That was a Zionist myth. That is quite clearly not what he said, but it doesn't matter.
You're bursting a bubble for me. I'm like, grew up with that myth too.
What he actually said was a Russian curse of some kind, but it doesn't matter, because we need the mythology, we need the myths, and Hannah Senesh was a necessary character. The Jews needed that kind of heroine so that they could tell themselves a different story about the Second World War and rise to the challenges that were coming after that war, primarily the War of Independence. They needed a Joan of Arc character. And Hannah Senesh was that character. She became that character. Who she really was much more complicated. And in many ways, the closer you get to the real Hannah Senesh, the more human she becomes, the more flawed she seems, and the more amazing she is. Because when you realize that a real person did what she did, it becomes not less impressive, but more impressive.
Your book taught me something I had never read before, that there was a double agent, and most of the time everybody in the Germans knew where they were going. When you discovered that, how was that for you? Or had you already known that before?
No, I had never heard that. It had been published, so it's not like I'm discovering something that was unknown to historians, but it never became part of the story. And in order to find that, you'd have to look in some pretty obscure places. The couriers who served the Zionist movement running messages in and out of occupied Europe were German agents. The same couriers were working for the Americans. They were all working for the Wehrmacht, for the Abwehr, which is the German intelligence service. So the entire mission is quite obviously transparent to the Germans from the very beginning. Now, we don't know exactly what that means for the outcome of the mission. So, for example, Hannah Senesh crosses the border into Hungary and is immediately arrested. Is that because the Germans knew she was coming and were waiting for her? Maybe. Is it just because there happened to be a police presence on the border and she blundered into a police checkpoint? That is also possible. We don't really know, but it's certainly true that this very secret mission was not a secret to the enemy.
It makes me feel sad. You are living in Israel, and where she has a bigger presence. When you discovered some of these, bursting balloons about your myth, how do you deal with that?
I think that the human texture of the story makes the characters more amazing. I think that once you start really getting into the nitty-gritty of what this operation looked like and who the people were and how flawed they were, and the characters are not knights in shining armor. They don't like each other all the time. Hannah's
I don't like her sometimes.
Hannah's comrades do not like Hannah. She's a pain in the neck. She's really stubborn. She won't listen to reason as far as they're concerned. And another one of the amazing characters in this story is another woman named Chaviva Reich, who's the other heroine of the story. And she doesn't become famous as the symbol of the mission because her personal life is too complicated, and it just doesn't match the profile of the hero.
She had a lot of lovers. She was a very robust woman.
That's right. She didn't play by the rules, and that makes her more amazing. So if we have these two-dimensional characters, which is what we grew up with. I mean, Hannah Senesh as a kind of Zionist poster, and that's not interesting at all. I'm not interested in that at all. And that's one of the reasons that these characters are really set aside after the 1950s and 60s, after the end of the mythic hagiographic period of Israel's history, because they're associated with this kind of, two-dimensional heroism that doesn't seem to invite further inquiry. But in fact, they were incredible characters, and they were unbelievably smart, and they were very self-aware, and they knew, and this was maybe the most incredible thing for me, they knew what they were getting into. I mean, Senesh was 22 years old when she jumped out of that airplane, and she knew what she was getting into, and that makes her much more amazing than a two-dimensional character. I'm focusing on 4 characters who really embody the drama at the center of the mission, which is why I chose these 4 characters. The 4 are Hannah, of course, because you can't avoid writing about Hannah, Chaviva, who I mentioned, Enzo Sereni, who's an incredible character, is an Italian. He's the commander of the mission, who's not meant to jump himself into Europe, but does. And the 4th is a man named Chaim Hermesh, who has been basically forgotten because he survived. He, in some ways, didn't understand the mission. So he comes back alive, and he writes a fantastic memoir called Operation Amsterdam, which allows us to kind of bring the whole operation to life. So he is a particular favorite of mine, and he's the 4th main character in my version of events.
Did she have blue eyes or green eyes, or it doesn't matter? I love that struggle you had with facts.
Right. When you look at the records about Hannah and the different versions of Hannah's life and writing, you get all kinds of different literary flourishes, including some disagreement about the color of her eyes. According to her agent file, her eyes were blue.
And you don't think it really matters, but you felt that they were. I like that. So you felt her, and I'd like to hear what that looks like.
Because she left so much writing. She leaves a diary, a wonderful diary that she starts writing when she's very, very young. She leaves us a list of all the books she ever read from age 12, if I'm not mistaken, until the mission begins more than a decade later. She wrote poems, of course. So we can really feel Hannah's personality more so than the other characters. And I really feel like I spent time with her, so I can kind of imagine her character, and her character is wonderful. I mean, she was not an easy person, I think, and she's very idealistic, and she's very, very headstrong, and she has all kinds of ideas, but she is an incredible character, and there is a reason that she becomes the symbol of the mission, which some of the other participants think is unjust, because of course all kinds of people participated in the mission, and Hannah Senesh, in military terms, did not accomplish anything. The truth is that none of these people accomplished very much in military terms, and they were meant to save Jews and fight the Nazis, and they don't seem to have saved a single Jew or killed a single Nazi, as I write. So the mission was up to something different. And when we understand what the real purpose of the mission was, then it's easier to understand why Hannah Senesh becomes the immortal symbol, the one who we're still talking about 80 years later.
Do you want to talk to me a bit about Anne Frank and how she's also a symbol, but it's not the same way. I was struck by the sort of cynicism or more biting way that you talk about Anne Frank, compared to how they died.
The great symbol to come out of the Holocaust is Anne Frank, who is a very young Jewish girl from Amsterdam who writes a diary, lives in hiding, and is ultimately arrested and murdered in a camp. And she becomes elevated after the war to the status of a universal hero. I mean, she's incredibly famous in Japan, for example, and there's a play about Anne Frank in movies, and Anne Frank has become such a generic symbol of victimhood that she is currently being appropriated by political movements across the world. So she becomes a symbol of migrants, and she becomes a symbol of nonconformist sexuality, and she becomes a symbol of the Palestinians, and she becomes a symbol of whatever anyone wants. There's an attempt during COVID to compare, the requirement to wear a mask to the persecution of Anne Frank. She comes up in every context to a point where her name has really become meaningless, and we have to remind ourselves that this was a real person. She was this poor Jewish girl who was murdered, and I really resent the way that her memory has been abused. The reason that she becomes a symbol is because she makes a point that is palatable to the world. So she has that famous line in her diary where she writes that she believes that people are really good at heart, and she dies quietly in a camp and doesn't live beyond the end of the war to make inconvenient demands of Christians and Muslims, like, we want a state where Jews can defend themselves. So she's not associated with any of that, and she's kind of easy to digest in a way. I'm not saying that the real Anne Frank was, but the image of her that's created by the curators of her memory, like her father, after the war, creates that character, and she's world famous. Hannah Senesh, who is in many ways Anne Frank's counterpart, they in fact share the same name, because Hannah in Hungary, her name is Anna Senesh, and she Hebraicizes it to Hannah, but Hannah is in many ways the opposite of Anne Frank, because she makes a political choice. She moves to the land of Israel, and she wears a uniform, and she takes a gun, and she jumps out of an airplane and returns to the Holocaust to save Anne Frank, or people like Anne Frank. So she's acting, and that's a very different kind of tragedy in the eyes of the Zionist movement. So they both end up murdered by fascists. I mean, so you could say, what's the difference? Who cares how they got there? The end is the same. But for Zionism, it matters very much. I mean, and Hannah Senesh was a woman of action. She took action, and the key element of Zionism is action. That's what differentiates a Zionist from a non-Zionist. A Zionist acts. So you have two very different heroes, one of whom becomes globally famous, and one of whom is known mainly to Jews and Israelis because she makes people uncomfortable, just as Zionism makes people uncomfortable, because it's making a demand of other people. It's saying, we understand what happened during this war, and we now demand a place for ourselves where we can ensure that doesn't happen again. Hannah Senesh makes that demand, and Frank does not, of course, and that has something to do with why the treatment of those two women is so different.
It strikes me again that this quote from your book, "Strength isn't sympathy, as Israel will learn later," speaks exactly to what you just said. The Jews who were victims, quote unquote, Anne Frank, got a state. Today, the strong Jews who are fighting back, everyone hates them. Was that a message that you want people to understand from this book about where Israel's at today and where it came from and the choice that the country made?
Sure. I mean, people are very comfortable with victimhood, and the currency in discourse in the West is a currency of victimhood. You're supposed to make yourself seem like the greatest victim possible, and that gives you the greatest cultural clout. And it, of course, is very prevalent in Canada in the way that people present themselves. But it's not just Canada, and Zionism never played that game. That's not what Zionism was trying to do. They weren't trying to go around, some sob story about how we should be pitied. They were telling a story about strength, and that story is uncomfortable for a lot of people. Dara Horn, who's a colleague and a friend wrote a book a few years ago called People Love Dead Jews, which is a provocative title that says something that I think is true. As long as the Jews are quietly, lying there, not disturbing anyone, it's fine. We can romanticize them. We can see the Anne Frank play. We'll go to Schindler's List. Okay. But if the Jews are actively defending a piece of land against the people trying to kill them, there's a lot less sympathy for that. And we have to navigate it as Jews and Israelis. And clearly Israelis would rather be universally loved, but I think most of us understand that that's not an option, and it's better to be alive and hated. And that is very much the story that's embodied by Hannah Senesh and by her comrades.
You mentioned the great-grandchildren today and Yuval and those people who are taking up the arms that their great-great-grandparents did not. I want to ask you finally, the book comes out in the middle of the war.
Yeah, I really hope this isn't the middle of the war, Ellen. I really hope that this is the end of the war, because if it's the middle, that means we have another 2.5 years, and I'm not sure how. I'm not sure we have enough fuel in the tank to get us through. But
God willing, amen to that. Amen, amen.
People like Hannah and Enzo and Chaviva and Chaim, they were optimists. They understood that there was going to be a war for Jewish independence, but they thought that would be the only war, and then everything would kind of be normalized and their own children would be able to live lives of peace. And that turns out not to be true. And the heroism that was required of them is required of their children and their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And in some ways, spiritually, Yuval and Hersh are their descendants who are facing a world that is not as different from their world as we had hoped.
New York City got us open like a game of tennis. I hit the glip pow how, that's a Hannah Senesh.
There's a rap video now, a rap song by Kosha Dills about Hannah Senesh. Have you seen it? And why do you think she's having her moment now?
I know. I watched it after you sent it to me. I had no idea that it existed, and it's something to see. I mean, I'm not sure it's going to crack the Billboard top 10, but there is something about this character that is having a moment. I mean, people were not interested in this story for many, many years, and 2 books just came out about this story. And there's this song.
And a play. There's a play that's been around for a while off Broadway. Yeah, in Yiddish too. Yeah,
I saw the Hannah Senesh play off Broadway, and something's going on. Like, something's going on with Hannah Senesh. There's a moment where she makes sense, where people are looking around for role models and for heroes, and they're finding her, and that's exactly what was supposed to happen. That's what the people behind this mission wanted to happen. You look around at a moment of darkness, and you see different ways to respond. Someone runs away, someone hides in a basement, someone collaborates, someone tries to cut a deal with the authorities, and someone takes a weapon and jumps out of an airplane to save her brothers and sisters. And people want to hear more about that.
I think that's beautiful. And I wish you all the best in your launch.
Thank you so much, Ellen.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounded like for this episode of North Star, made possible by the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. This is Friedman's 5th book exploring key moments in the story of the Jewish state. He also wrote about Leonard Cohen's visit to the front lines during the 73 war and about an IDF outpost in southern Lebanon known as the Pumpkin. You can learn more about Out of the Sky and watch the new rap song about Hannah Senesh by Kosha Dills. The links are all in our show notes. North Star is produced by Zachary Judah Kaufman. Michael Freeman is the executive producer, and Alicia Richler is our editorial director. Thanks for listening.